Welcome to the Friday Night Campfire Stories. My name is Rob, and I will be your host for this evening. It is the first Friday of the month. That means we are starting a brand new story today. I'm excited to bring you my story called Survive. Survive follows Martin, who is somebody who's lived in society for too long, and he's just decided he's had enough. It's time to move on. He wants to start relying solely on himself and living off of the grid, making a life and community of his own. The only problem with it is that Martin doesn't really have a whole lot of survival skills. He also learns that the monsters in society may be the least of his worries compared to what's out there in the woods. So, without further ado, let's waste no more time. This is my story, Survive. Survive, Chapter 1. The cold bit at Martin's fingers as he fumbled with the remnants of his trail mix. The forest, dense and oppressive, seemed to press in around him from all sides. He had been out here for a week, but it felt like an eternity. He was no survivalist. The closest he had ever come to roughing it was a weekend camping trip with his college friend, where they had spent more time drinking beer than learning to live off the land. He looked around at his poorly built shelter, a flimsy structure of sticks and leaves that barely kept the wind out, let alone the rain. The nights were the worst, filled with the sounds he couldn't identify and shadows that seemed to move on their own. His body ached from sleeping on the hard ground, and stomach rumbled constantly, a painful reminder of his lack of preparedness. Martin sat by the small fire that he managed to keep going, more by luck than skill. He had found a few dry twigs and some moss he used as kindling, but he knew it wouldn't last. The fire's warmth was comforting though, and he leaned in close, trying to absorb as much as he could. He pulled out the last of his trail mix and began rationing it, counting out the individual nuts and dried fruit pieces. He had 2 packs left from his original 30, and he knew he needed to make it last. His mission was clear: survive the wilderness as long as possible, even if it meant the rest of his life. But reality was setting in, and he realized just how unprepared he was. The sun had dipped below the horizon, and the forest was bathed in eerie twilight. Martin looked up at the canopy of trees above him, the branches swaying gently in the evening breeze. The forest was alive with sounds, the rustle of leaves, the chirping of insects, and something else, something he couldn't quite place. A low, distant growl rumbled through the trees, sending a shiver down Martin's spine. He had heard it before, a few nights ago, but had dismissed it as his imagination. Now, alone, in the darkening forest, he wasn't so sure. He strained his ears, trying to pinpoint the source of the noise, but it seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. Martin shook his head, trying to clear his thoughts. "Get a grip," he muttered to himself. "It's just an animal. Probably a bear or a wolf. Nothing you can't handle." But deep down, he knew it wasn't just a wolf or a bear. There was something else out there. Something watching. He stood up and stretched, his muscles protesting the movement. It was time to gather more firewood. The thought of venturing away from his small circle of light made his heart race, but he knew he had no choice. Without the fire, he would freeze before morning. As he moved through the trees, he kept his eyes and ears open, alert for any signs of danger. The forest seemed to close in around him, the shadows growing longer and darker with each passing minute. He picked up a few fallen branches and began to make his way back to camp when he heard it again, a rustling in the underbrush, followed by a low, guttural sound that made his hair on the back of his neck stand on end. Martin froze, his heart pounding in his chest. He slowly turned his head, scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. For a moment, he thought he saw something, a large, hulking figure moving between the trees, but it had gone in an instant, leaving him questioning his sanity. He hurried back to the shelter, his arms full of firewood, and quickly fed the flame. The fire roared to life, casting flickering shadows on the trees around him. He sat down, his back against a large rock, and tried to calm his racing heart. "It's just your imagination," he told himself again, though the words sounded hollow. He had never believed in monsters, but the noises in the forest were making him question everything he thought he knew. The night wore on, and Martin found himself dozing off despite his fear. He was exhausted, both physically and mentally. His body demanded rest. He drifted in and out of sleep, his dreams filled with dark, shadowy figures and haunting growls. At some point in the night, he awoke to the sound of snapping twigs. His eyes flew open, and he peered into the darkness, straining to see. The fire had died down to embers, and the forest was eerily quiet. Too quiet. He listened, holding his breath, and then he thought he heard a soft thud, like something heavy being set down gently on the forest floor. His mind raced, imagining all the sorts of horror lurking just beyond the reach of the dying firelight. For a long while, he sat there, clutching a makeshift spear that he had fashioned from a sharp rock and a sturdy branch. His eyes darted around the camp, watching for any signs of movement, but nothing came. Slowly, the fear began to ebb, replaced by a weary resignation. As dawn broke, Martin rose stiffly from his spot and stretched. He felt a little better in the light of day, but the memory of the night's noises lingered. He needed to find food and improve his shelter if he was going to survive out there. The thought of giving up never crossed his mind. He was determined to prove himself that he could do this, that he could live off the land. But as he set out to forage berries and edible plants, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The forest, beautiful and serene in the daylight, held secrets that he was only beginning to uncover. He pushed the thought aside and focused on the task at hand. Survival was all that mattered. Later on that day, as he knelt by a stream to drink, he heard it again, a distant, mournful howl that sent chills down his spine. He looked around, but saw nothing. The beast, whatever it was still out there, and it was getting closer. Martin stood on the edge of the stream, the icy water numbing his bare feet. He had fashioned a crude fishing line from some vine he found and bent a safety pin he had in his pocket to make a hook. It wasn't much, but it was all he had. His stomach growled as he stared at the water, willing a fish to bite. He had plenty of fish darting around the clear stream earlier, the silver scales flashing in the sunlight, but now, as he stood there, trying to keep his hands steady, they seemed to have disappeared. Minutes stretched into hours, and still nothing. Frustration built inside him, and he let out a low growl of his own, pulling the line from the water. "This is pointless," he muttered, throwing his line down on the ground. He sat on a nearby rock and buried his face in his hands. He was so hungry, and the meager rations of trail mix were not enough to sustain him. He needed real food. After a few moments of self-pity, Martin took a deep breath and stood up. He couldn't afford to give up. He needed to try. He gathered his fishing line and moved downstream, hoping a change of location might bring better luck. But after another hour of fruitless attempts, he admitted defeat. The fish were either too smart or too elusive for his amateur skills. Dejected, Martin returned to his camp. His shelter, a pitiful lean-to made of sticks and leaves, looked even worse in the harsh light of day. Determined to improve, he set off to work, gathering more branches and foliage. He tried to weave the branches together, creating a more solid wall, but they refused to stay in place. The structure collapsed twice under his efforts, each failure chipping away at his already fragile resolve. Sweat dripped down from his face as he worked, his hands scraped and bleeding from the rough branches. He paused to wipe his brow, taking a moment to catch his breath. The sound of the forest around him was almost peaceful, a stark contrast to the turmoil in his mind. With renewed determination, Martin gathered more leaves and branches, carefully placing them to reinforce his shelter. But every time he thought he had it, a gust of wind or his own clumsy movement would send it crashing down again. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, he realized he had made little progress. His shelter was still a flimsy pile of sticks and leaves. "Damn it," he shouted, kicking at the fallen branches in frustration. The forest swallowed his cry. The only response was the rustling leaves in the breeze. He sat down heavily, his energy spent. He was no carpenter, no woodsman. He was just trying to survive, and failing miserably. As dusk settled in, the familiar sense of dread crept over him. He remembered the sounds from the previous night, the unseen presence that seemed to stalk him. He couldn't just sit here and wait for it to come again. He needed a plan. Martin stood and looked around his camp, his mind racing. He needed to protect himself, to create some sort of defense against whatever it was out there. He decided to make a trap, something simple but effective. If he could catch the creature, or at least scare it away, he might have a chance. He searched the area for materials, finding a few strong vines and some sharp sticks. He worked quickly, his fear giving him a new sense of purpose. He set up a snare near the edge of the camp, the sharp sticks positioned to impale anything that it caught. It wasn't perfect, but it was the best that he could do with what he had. As he finished setting a trap, darkness began to envelope the forest. He retreated to his fire, feeding it more wood and watching as the flames danced higher. The firelight flickered on the trees, casting long, dark shadows. He sat down, his back against the rock, and clutched his makeshift spear. His eyes scanned the darkness, every rustle of leaf and snap of twigs making his heart race. He listened intently, his senses on high alert. Hours passed, the fire crawling softly. Just as he began to drift into restless sleep, he heard it again. The low, guttural growl, closer this time. His eyes flew open as he gripped his spear tighter. The beast was out there, something in the darkness, watching him. A sudden snap echoed through the trees, followed by a high-pitched squeal. Martin's heart leaped into his throat. He jumped to his feet, his spear at the ready, and edged towards the source of the noise. The trap. Had it worked? He approached cautiously, his breath coming in short, shallow gasps. The moonlight filtered through the trees, casting an eerie glow on the scene. There, caught in his snare, was a small animal, thrashing wildly. It was a rabbit, its fur matted and eyes wide with fear. Martin felt a pang of guilt, but also a surge of relief. He had caught something, his first real food in days. The creature let out another squeal, trying to escape the snare, but it was securely trapped. Martin knelt down and ended its suffering quickly, his hands trembling. He picked up the rabbit, its body warm and soft, and headed back to the fire. The encounter had left him shaken, but also more determined. He had survived another night, and now he had food. The beast was still out there, but for now, his immediate needs took precedence. He would have to be smarter, more resourceful. His mission was clear: survive no matter what. And he would. He had to. That is going to do it for today. I hope that you guys did enjoy. If you did, be sure to click that like button. Hit that subscribe button. Earlier this week, we did hit the 50 subscriber mark. I'm very happy and very excited that we were able to do that. I want to thank each and every one of you that have hit subscribe so far. As one journey ends, we do start another, as now we are on our road to 100 subscribers. So if you're not subscribed, be sure to click that subscribe button and join part of the Campfire community. We make 3 videos every single week. Every Monday we do an episode of Echoes of the Past, which is my paranormal location series where we look into history and hauntings that take place in certain locations. Every Wednesday we do an episode of Far From Fiction, which is my true crime series. And then every Friday, of course, the namesake of the channel, the Friday Night Campfire Stories. Also, going off of my announcement from last week, I am releasing my second collection of stories, not short stories, but these will just be an anthology series. It will be called A Perfect Journey Through Villainous Eyes. It's coming out March 1st. You can pre-order the e-reader edition now, and then the paperback edition will be coming out on March 1st. I'm very excited to share those stories with you guys. I think you guys are really, really going to enjoy them. I think I took a very big leap in my writer's journey. If you have any interest in that, the link will be down in the description below. That is going to do it for today. I hope you guys did enjoy. And as always, thank you for spending a little bit of your evening here with me.